So I hoped many of you joined us on our original payroll protection program and economic injury disaster loan webinar. If you did not see that and you're interested in that information, you can find that on our website. Otherwise, again, welcome today. Joining us is me, Kevin Mullen. I'm the Advisory Services Manager here at Mullen Associates.
And my name is Charles Steinmetz. I'm a Senior Advisor here at Mullen Associates as well.
So we're going to be going over, play a little tag here as we go over a couple of the primary differences between what originally was passed through the Payroll Protection Program and now what the Flexibility Act adjusts. So we're not going to be going over any of the economic injury disaster loan information today. If you have questions about that, let us know. But today primarily focuses on what I'll heretofore reference as the PPPFA. It's a kind of a mouthful.
Yeah.
Okay, but we're going to go ahead and jump in. So Clark, if you will pull up our information here. Okay, thank you so much. So let's go ahead and move on to the next slide, and we can dive into some of these initial differences. First, what I'll mention is, of course, this was signed into law, was passed by the House, I think, on May the 28th, and then by the Senate on June the 3rd, and then the President signed it into law on June the 5th. So it was pretty fast moving, and a lot of this was to clear up some of the we'll call it ambiguities through the payroll protection program and a lot of the difficulties that everybody was trying to figure out. So if we can go ahead and populate that, thank you. So the first kind of difference that I want to mention is the period of time in which they are allowing businesses and applicants to be able to spend the funds in regards to the payroll and the other qualifying expenses. Again, if you want to dive into those details, our first webinar had that information in it. But this 8-week transition to 24 weeks is super important because this 8-week period was actually really difficult when you're getting 2.5 times your average monthly payroll and you have 2 months to pay it all out. It was really complicated because it also depended on what day your payroll fell on, right? And when you paid your employees. And so for some people, it was really difficult to get to those paying amounts, those limitations that they were required to pay in just that 8-week window. So
there were challenges on the business side of things, but there was exceptional challenges for those who were self-employed because you're considering your payroll, what you paid yourself, was just that 8 weeks. So the other component was something you were looking at saying, I'm just going to have to pay this as a loan, a low loan, but a loan at the same time.
Yeah, and what Charlie specifically is referencing is if the payroll protection program says, here's 2.5 times your monthly payroll, right? That's 10 weeks of payroll, and you're paying yourself 8 weeks of payroll, you're not going to hit the full 10 weeks.
Correct.
So for independent contractors, there was this potential issue of a portion of that loan just couldn't be forgivable unless you were meeting some of the other requirements. So this alleviates that concern. It gives you 24 weeks in order to pay everything out. And so everybody should be able to meet their requirements at that point. So that was beneficial. They also did, and Charlie, I don't know if you read this, but they they changed some of the verbiage as well to make sure that it indicated for employees that were working, you could include payroll costs for the employee when it was worked, not just when it was paid. Because under the old rules, it was when it was paid. And so if your payroll fell on 8 weeks and 1 day, then you didn't have that payroll within that 8-week period. And so it caused issues.
True.
But now they have extended it to cover when it was worked, not just when it was paid. Which again, in a 24-week period shouldn't be a problem.
Right, it's a nicety, but if you have 24 weeks to pay it all, it shouldn't, in the end, make a big impact, which is good.
Yeah, I think that they just were trying to make it real clear that they didn't want it to be as hard and fast as it originally appeared to be. Yeah. So then the next piece that we'll cover is the loan payback period. Now, this assumes that not all of your loan is forgiven. So if you meet the qualifications for all of the loan to be forgiven, this piece is not important, right? But for those of you who won't qualify for all of the loan to be forgiven, the loan's not bad. I mean, the interest rate is, 1%? Yeah. And so it basically the way that it started was you had 6 months to begin paying back the loan, and it had to be paid back over 2 years. This was changed to where now you have 10 months after the covered period. The covered period was extended to December 31st of 2020, which means it's October of 2021 before you have to start paying back any of it. And you have 5 years to pay back the amount. And so a lot more flexibility in a Flexibility Act for you for the loan repayment portion, which is nice. The next piece is the loan forgiveness. So this is where now take the paying back part out of it. Now we're looking at what portion is forgiven and when it is forgiven. So now it's the cover period again extended from June the 30th instead to December the 31st. I'm mixing up my dates here. It was 6 months after the approved payment through the program.
6 months to apply for the forgiveness. So when your covered period, your 8 weeks was up, you had X amount of time to submit the paperwork to have it forgiven.
Yeah.
So now that the date has been moved, it's not, X amount of time from June 30th. The way that it's all written is that it's X amount of time from December 31st. And it's now that X amount of time has been expanded to 10 months.
Yeah. The one thing, and so there's still some ambiguity left. Of course, we're talking about our wonderful federal government. And so Congress isn't going to be able to keep everything completely 100% clean.
Yep.
So there are a few things that I want to bring up. One of the things is that technically, the way the bill is currently written is that the application window in order to apply for the payroll protection program has been extended, again, technically, the way it's written, until December 31st. However, there are several members of Congress who have already written and supported a letter of intent that has been put through to indicate that Congress intended that the application window still end on June the 30th. So if you have not applied yet for your payroll protection program loan, you have a very short window to get it done, right? You still can do it, but I know that some banks, I know there were a couple, Texan Bank, told one of my clients that they were shutting down their applications. I think Chase is no longer, I believe,
I didn't look.
but I believe that Chase is no longer, approving those applications. I know that Wells Fargo is no longer approving those applications. So I know there are a couple of banks and some big ones who are no longer approving these. Last I heard, Woodforest and Amegy are two Texas local banks who are still putting these through. So those are the two primary ones that I've been recommending my clients contact. So if you're still looking to apply for a loan, that's where I would start. Well, start at your current commercial lender, but then transition to either Amegy or Woodforest if you're not successful with your lender.
Now, this is processing the new applications because the window of time, the 8 weeks to 24 weeks, is not a automatic change as we read it. So you still need to contact your lender, whoever you went to, even if it was Wells Fargo, who's no longer processing applications, because it needs to be you and them to agree to, hey, I don't want to do this over 8 weeks. I want to do this over 24 weeks. And they have to say, yeah, we want you to do it over 24 weeks, not 8 weeks. And so as long as that gets amended properly, then you get that period of time. So there's differences in the application getting the funding in the first place. You have potentially limited sources of where to go. But then you have the window of who you're already working with. You'll need to do some of that to maximize this if it's needed. We anticipate a lot of folks would need it, which is why they passed it, but if it's needed. But then you have the third thing we're talking about is that forgiveness window, which again, the way everything is written is that we've got a while for the need before we need to do this. And so bear in mind this PPPFA, whatever acronym we're using.
PPPFA,
yep. That, right, is not very long. And so we can extrapolate a lot of information from that, but just like the CARES Act with everything in there, they need time to write some more fine print. Congress had to do a little letter of intent to say, oh, hey, just in case, this is what we really meant, guys. There's more of that going on. I was doing some reading here just before we started, and what I've read is that the SBA and the Treasury are putting out another, if you've been keeping up with those interim final rules, more fine print, and they expect to publish something tomorrow is what I was able to read. So there's more just fine print as well, the term I use, to come help define some of the things that are there. But we're talking about everything that is written in the bill, and here's what was passed.
Yeah. And just to clarify one of the points, thank you, Charlie, to clarify one of the points that Charles was talking about is any PPP funding or applications that were done prior to June the 5th. So if any of you have PPP money and now what you're really looking at is the forgiveness side of things, and if that application was done prior to June the 5th, this is really important for you. You have to, and the bill I think says specifically, mutually agree is the words that the bill uses with your lender in order to bring to date your original application. So you've got to contact your original lender and say, I want us to mutually agree to go off of the new rules, not the old rules, and they should be able to facilitate that change. I don't see any reason why they should give you any guff on trying to get that updated or modified, but I mean, it's based on the individual lender, so they don't have to mutually agree. So you don't have the law on your side to strong arm them for the new rules. You've got to ask them or mutually agree for those new rules. Okay. So other than that, one last thing that I will mention is, a couple things, but the payroll costs have been updated to include if you're paying furloughed employees, and the other piece is for hazard pay or bonus pay. So it's not just having to maintain the current existing pay schedule prior to February the 15th of your employees. You can pay them more if you're giving them hazard pay or if you're paying furloughed employees a portion of their salary or things like that. So you do have the opportunity to extend what these payroll costs mean. Again, that's another part that's stipulated in the bill itself. Okay.
So on the forgiveness side of things, of the bill, there were some other changes in, call it requirements. So one of the requirements that used to be was that of what was forgiven, you had to utilize at least 75% of the funding that you received for employees. You can use some things like rent or mortgage interest for your business properties as forgivable expenses, but they put some kind of cap in there to say, guys, this is to keep people on payroll. You can't just pay off this and then call it good. And so that's what it was originally. It has now been changed to 60-40. And so it's a little more flexible in that. So we're going to term of the webinar, but in that you've got to do at least 60% of your of the funding you received for payroll, and the rest of it can be for the not payroll things. It was originally written, and it looks like 60% was kind of like a hard line. It has to be at least this. In that interim final rule, I mentioned that we expect to be published tomorrow. It's rumored that there will be a, what's the word I'm looking for?
Well, okay, so let me talk about this a little bit, because it was really interesting when this was being discussed in the House. Senator Marco Rubio was saying, no, the way this verbiage is shown, it's hard and fast. So either you meet 60% of this PPP loan for payroll, or none of it is forgivable. And the way the SBA had interpreted the original PPP was that basically any portion of the money that you used for payroll up to 75%, or at least 75%, anyways, could be forgiven. So even if you only used 20% of the loan for payroll, and you use the rest for utilities and interest and that kind of stuff, it just means that only a portion of that would be forgivable. But Senator Rubio was coming in saying, the way this is written is it must be at least 60%, or none of it is forgivable. So it's hard and fast. but then now they're expected to come through with some regulations
So the
tomorrow
fine print on
that will make it more like the
Correct.
older rules, which is even if you only use
you
20%
can have
for
a
payroll.
prorated type
Yeah.
amount because there's exceptions and stuff in there. And
Yeah.
so we can't say that with absolute clarity until they have actually published it. And so personally, I think it would logically make sense that PPP, the intent is for your employees. They give you 24 weeks to spend it on the payroll. At least 60% of it should be no problem. And so it shouldn't be an issue. There may be a couple of individual cases that may be a separate piece. But knowing that was there, the SBA has updated the PPP forgiveness application to reflect the 60% payroll versus 75%, which is nice. And so the payroll, they have updated that piece. When looking through that, the application paperwork, again, we've got time on this, especially if we get that extra, you go in and have your loan amended with some, I'm losing words here, but you get that amended to give that 10-month period versus the 6 months period. We've got time on this. It's not an immediate thing you got to go and do right now. But the paperwork, they seem to have streamlined it. It's pretty recent, so they may add more later, but what I printed today was 5 pages of the new loan application for their forgiveness. The old one, which had the 75% number, was 10 pages. There wasn't more to fill out. The 10 pages had more instructions. When we say this, this is what this means. This, interprets into this thing. So if you're going through it and wanted to kind of get ahead of the game and at least go through and do a dry run of your forgiveness application and you're confused on, well, what are they trying to say here? It is mostly straightforward. Hopefully it doesn't cause too much confusion, but it may be worth at least considering looking at the old paperwork for definitions on what do they mean on those pieces. It could be a benefit. Just wanted to toss that in. So the other piece that was changed in the paperwork and also in the acronym,
PPPFA.
that what was changed in that was there's a limitation on your employees, right? So initially it was hey, you apply for this, you have 10 employees. Things go bad, you have to let employees go. You apply for your forgiveness, you now only have 4 employees. That had a negative math effect to how much you could do on the forgiveness. And so, which also to a degree made sense with the PPPFA. I get it right?
Yes, sir.
I'm beautiful. All right. So what has added in is they're called safe harbor, call it an exception. They now have an allowance for, hey, there are extenuating circumstances under which you can have a reduction in employees and not have a negative math reduction in your forgiveness amount. That is included in the application paperwork. I don't want to go over those in excruciating detail. It's not a get out of jail free card. It's not a let's manipulate the situation so that we can keep more of this for ourselves, because that's not, again, what the intent is, and that's not who we are in trying to do those kinds of things. But it is there for the circumstances under which that they need to be there.
So like, for example, right? For example, if you fire one of your employees for cause, the changes here are to keep you from being penalized and having to keep employees during the window in which you would have fired for cause, right? And so that's just an example, because under the old rules, it would have penalized you for that. This allows and provides an exception under certain circumstances. Like one of those is, one of the exceptions is, yep, your operating income is just still significantly reduced. And so
you still only got 8 weeks of payroll. They give you 24 weeks to forgive it, but you're looking at this saying, guys, I haven't done anything for 6 months. What do you mean I need to have the same amount of employees? There's some change there.
Yeah. And by the way, as the covered period is extended to December the 31st of 2020, so is the period of time in which you must maintain your employees until December the 31st of 2020. And that's why this matters a lot, because you get, 2.5 times your average monthly payroll and keeping employees until December. But if your business isn't generating revenue for the rest of the months of the year, then the PPP loan is not enough to cover you. And so if you're not generating that income, you can't maintain the employees with 2.5 times your monthly payroll.
And that'd be something that I'd be interested to see in this new rule they publish tomorrow, because the application, the way it's written is, at the time of application, how many employees do you have? If you're not filling out the application until, July of next year, you're like, hey, I'm good. I don't know how that exactly goes. Kevin's initial feeling was, no, it's the loan period that you had. What are your employees then? Which would make logical sense, and I follow that. It's just, we read what's on paper and go, here's what we're stuck with. So that extra information, all that extra fine print will be helpful. We don't want it to be helpful in a negative way. We want it to be helpful in a good way. But just that extra time will give them, one, you've got time to put all that stuff together, but they've got time to write those rules to benefit us the most.
Well, and the PPP program was launched on April the 3rd for entities, and April the 10th for independent contractors. And it was late April, I think it was 3 weeks later, 2.5 weeks later, that the SBA came out with 31 pages of regulations, right? And so, it's a living, breathing, ever evolving thing. And this is probably one of the more final steps of evolution, but even still, they're having to come out with these letters of intent and additional regulations from the SBA on how they're gonna operate based on the PPPFA updates.
So last thing I want to mention on the paperwork itself, for those that are watching, those who have corporation entities, businesses, lots of employees, there is a few steps you need to go through in loan paperwork. Those who are self-employed, I'm one of those associates, we have a lot of folks who are self-employed, independent contractors, etc. As you're looking through the math, looking at the number of employees, payroll, etc., you can ignore a lot of that page that is involved. There's a section that is compensation to owners, and that is for amount paid to owners, self-employed individuals, etc. All you have to do is put your payroll on that line. So again, we have a lot of those. We want to make sure we get that in for those. If they're listening or tuning in for that piece, that should be all you need to fill out for that almost whole wall of information. Those who have employees and stuff, you have a lot more information to go through, but with payroll and filings and 940s, and you're used to lots of extra paperwork anyway, so it should be no different. But those who are self-employed looking at this and saying, oh, I don't understand this, it doesn't apply to you, which is great. That's great.
And of course, if you're looking for assistance in actually filling out the paperwork, give us a call or shoot us an email. We're happy to work with you. Okay, so now what we're going to transition into, and this will be the first time we're doing it this way, we're going to transition into a question and answer portion, but doing this the way that we are, we're going to try and give you an opportunity to actually speak your question out loud. So all of you are forcibly muted right now, but we've got our lovely assistant Clark here, who's going to be our Vanna White. He's going to have basically what we want you to do is we want you to type in the chat that you have a question. Just say, I have a question. And then Clark will go through kind of top to bottom. If you want to voice your question in that way, then he will unmute you and you'll be able to ask your question to us. We can have a little bit of back and forth. Please be respectful of everyone's time. Try not to provide us too long of a story. If you do, I'm gonna cut you off and try and get you down to your question. But providing context, of course, is important in really effectively answering your question. So we gotta give a little bit of time for that. If you don't want to voice your question, no problem. Just type that in the chat and Clark will read that question to us. Okay, so let's go ahead and transition into the Q&A portion now. If you have a question, please just type, I have a question. Clark, do we have anything yet?
Yes, we do. So I'm going to read a few questions that came in during the presentation.
Okay,
We'll
great.
wait for a few more to come through.
Now, real quick, can you guys hear Clark when he's reading that question? Can you guys type in chat that you can hear Clark when he's talking?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Go ahead, Clark.
Okay, so the first question on our list is, if my company never processed payroll, we will only use 1099 contractors. Do we still qualify for the payroll protection program?
Yeah, the quick answer to your question is yes. So the way that was asked, right, Charlie?
It may be difficult. So some of the paying independent contractors, there was back and forth on that, and they didn't qualify as payroll costs because they could go get their own essentially. And so there was weird back and forth. I know there's some of the for, some of the against. So I'd have to look at it again and just make sure, because there was all the interim rules and stuff passed.
Yeah.
It would be my
So
knee-jerk.
my understanding is if you were issuing them 1099s as independent contractors, that would qualify for payroll expenses. What Charlie's saying is correct in the sense that if they're independent contractors, they can file for their own payroll protection program. So you run the risk of you are a business and you get the payroll protection program, and then you have these independent contractors and they get the payroll protection program. And they're proving their own payroll and you're proving their payroll. You see where the issue is, right? Because you're double dipping. But it was my understanding that,
Sure.
that there were, if you were issuing a 1099, that you could include that in your expense. That may be a little bit of a higher level question that you need to work with us individually on. And so if you want to send us an email at info@molintax.com, and Clark, if you'll type that in the chat, please, info@molintax.com, then certainly we're willing to get with you on that. And then you can either ask Charles or ask myself or include both
Sure.
of our names on that. And we can look into that, because what Charlie's saying is right. That's what their concern was.
Right.
But the last I read it, which it had been a little bit since I looked into that particular issue, is that if you were issuing 1099s, that they might still qualify. Great question. Great question.
Okay, next question from Marcia. Do we just send the bank or business banker an email asking for the mutual agreement on new rules?
Yeah, you could definitely start by email. You just need to contact them. So the bill doesn't tell you, again, the law's not on your side. Like I mentioned earlier, you can't strong arm them into doing this. So however you had successfully contacted your lender before, that's how I would recommend you contact them again. I will tell you that these lenders are fed up with the PPP loans. They really are. The federal government is paying them 1% of these loans to do this. And wise man once told me never to complain about too much work. So I rarely do, but I will tell you, after dealing with some of these lenders, they have not been happy trying to deal with all of these EIDL loans and PPP loans. So give them a little bit of a break, because they're probably not going to be super happy now that this is ramping up again with the forgiveness and people trying to get these mutual agreements. But yes, I would contact them probably through email first. Give them 48 hours. If they don't get back to you, then I'd call them. That would be what I would do personally.
Right, I agree.
Great.
Okay, the next few questions are going to come from Karina.
Oh, okay, great.
The first one is the loan taxable?
No, the loan is not taxable whether you are an independent contractor or any type of business who qualifies for this loan. This loan is not taxable income.
Okay.
But let me dive in. Yeah, let me dive into the but here, and I'm going to try and make this real short, because I'm going to get into my technical brain as a tax advisor, and so this gets kind of complicated. Originally, the Payroll Protection Program came in saying that it's not taxable, but you cannot use the expenses that you incurred as a write-off, which essentially means it's taxable, right? But I will tell you that several of nationwide CPA organizations are fighting this. And so I think that we're going to see something in this regard. They already saw a little bit of progress, but nothing of a final nature. And so just follow my math here for a moment, right? Because if you received, $20,000 from the Payroll Protection Program, and you go and you pay your employees this $20,000, so you meet the loan forgiveness, everything's square. But now you don't get to write off this $20,000, which you would have in the previous year. It looks like you're $20,000 more profitable. You pay taxes based on profit. So now essentially you're taxed on it. So now Charlie and I will both tell you in what we do, any expenses that you're reimbursed should never be deducted.
Correct.
So logically, it makes sense.
Normal thing.
But effectively, it's acting as if it's taxable. And so that's where they're trying to come in and fight it. I really do think they're going to end up getting I think they will be successful in fighting this, because the intent is not to increase your tax liability. That's why they said it in the bill, that the loan was not taxable. And while it's not taxable in this way, it is effectively taxable. Because if it was taxable, then you would write off the expense, which then you end up at the same profit. So
Right.
it's
In
effectively
certain
taxable.
scenarios.
Yeah.
So there's the counter argument of the, hey, if you wouldn't have hired these employees back anyway, you wouldn't have had that cost. And so it's just trying to keep it out of your pocket and just keep the employees paid. And so, but one to note on this as well is, yes, the employees matter, but looking at this, it's taxable in the quasi way when you have employees. Those who are independent contractors
That's right.
shouldn't face them.
That's right.
And so if you are an independent contractor, you're just getting this and utilizing that with your PPP and the forgiveness, it won't affect your taxes in the way that Kevin is referencing for those who have corporations.
Yeah, and I know personally a couple of folks who are joining us today, thank you for being here, are independent contractors.
Right.
And so what Charlie is saying is a helpful answer to your question in which you're not taxed on it.
Okay, the next question. Did I understand that it is the loan forgiveness application submitted before June 5th or the original loan app before June 5th that requires mutual agreement by the bank for new terms?
Yes, if I didn't stipulate this, I apologize. Any loan applications post June 5th,
You already got the money.
the application submitted post June 5th.
Sure, but yes.
Yeah, so the application submitted post June 5th, you're square. You're under the new rules. And so it's just these that were done prior to June 5th, which again, your understanding is correct. If your application was processed prior to June 5th, you are under the old rules and you need the mutually agreement. You need the mutual agreement between you and your lender for the new rules.
To get the 10-month and 24-week, et cetera.
Yep.
Okay. Is there more money available? Can we get more money?
If you're asking if there's a second round of PPP approvals, that is not the case. So you cannot apply a second time. So if you've already applied, then you've received what you're going to receive. But if you have not yet applied, the last I checked,
Right.
which week and a half ago,
A
probably,
while ago, but yeah.
it was 517 billion of the 611 billion, I think, that was approved has been used. And the amount of applications that were still being processed was sharply declining,
Right.
which means you have time between now and June the 30th to get an application through.
Right.
And I would be floored. I would be shocked if they didn't have any money still available.
Right.
So I don't have an active number as of today, but I'm sure they do.
The challenge of finding a lender to do that for you. But if you have not yet received the funding, then yes, in that sense, more.
Yeah.
But if it's hey, you've already received your 8.5 weeks of payroll, is there more than that you can get? No.
Yeah, that's right. So I hope that answers your question.
Okay, the next question comes from Michael. So I'm going to go ahead and unmute you.
Maybe.
Can you hear me, gentlemen?
Yes.
Yeah, we can hear you, Michael.
And I think you've already covered what I'm going to ask in your previous question. I applied at the Bank of America. I applied the first week of May, and for whatever reason, paperwork wasn't right or whatever, it took them a long time to approve it. I just got an email last night, it's funny, saying that I have been approved. I haven't taken any money yet, but I just got approved. So basically what I'm hearing from you is I need to go back to them and say, hey, now I want the new rules and not the old rules. Is that what I need to do?
I would try. You've kind of hopped the gap there between hey, I applied for it here, but I got approved for it here. And so me personally, I play a lot of things conservative. I would go ahead and contact them and at least verify, hey, thank you for letting me know I was just approved. Do we need to change anything to utilize the new rules, or have you already applied the 10-month and 24-week, et cetera?
Yeah, and I would do the exact same thing because you're in an interesting spot. I would call them or email them to just confirm that you have the new rules. Remember, the date is June the 5th, and it's called the Payroll Protection Program Flexibility Act. So I would just ask them, do I operate under the PPPFA rules? Is this loan under the PPPFA rules or the PPP rules since I applied prior to June the 5th? So you come in there with knowledge like that, you should be able to get your answer very easily.
Okay. And the money they approved, let's say it's $20,000, instead of the 8 weeks, I would have 24 weeks to use that for payroll.
Correct.
Assuming the PPPFA rules, yes.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Michael, for your question. Appreciate you joining us.
We have one more question typed up from Kristen. We received PPP. We have already spent it 100% on payroll. Do we need to ask them to agree to the new rules?
Do you need to know? So you can process the loan application. The thing is the new rules give you more time to do that. And so if it's something that, you're a Johnny on the spot, want to get it taken care of, sure. And so it won't harm you by asking for the new rules. It would just give you more time to continue operating, get things up and going, and then process loan application forgiveness later.
So I think what Charlie's saying is it's not going to hurt, right?
Right.
However, it would be my opinion, if you have already met your obligations for forgiveness, that you not request that they update the loan to the new rules. Because there's, if again, you have met all the other requirements,
right.
Simply because why have, what am I trying to say here? Why have them modify your loan if you've already met your originally agreed upon terms? If it doesn't benefit you, then I wouldn't.
If you're a person who adheres to the, do today what you don't have to do. There's what's the
Yeah,
phrase on that?
Teddy Roosevelt, yeah. Don't do tomorrow what can be done today, or don't
Correct.
put off to tomorrow. Sorry,
Correct.
I butchered it, I know. But
if you're that kind of person, then yes, you don't need to change anything. If you're not that kind of person, you leave 3 days of dishes in the sink, and it's going to take you some time to do that application. By asking for the new rules, you would have more procrastination time. It's up to you.
I feel like you're personally attacking me, Charlie.
Maybe.
Okay. Any other questions? Does anybody else have anything that they want to ask?
So Tim has a question.
Oh, great.
What happens if I receive both EIDL and PPP funds? Is the forgiveness reduced?
Well, okay, so that's kind of complicated, and we'll go ahead and cover it. The EIDL grant of $10,000. So if you received the initial EIDL grant of $10,000,
Up to $10,000.
Sorry, thank you, Clark. Up to $10,000, whatever portion you received will reduce your forgivable amount. That was part of what you put on the paperwork. However, outside of the grant, none of the EIDL loan goes against the forgivable portion of the payroll protection program loan. So that's the quick answer to your question. Obviously, a detailed answer may be necessary based on your circumstances, which is going to be on the scope of what we can do today. Would you agree, Charlie?
Yes.
Charles, sorry. Charlie and I have been friends for a long time. So he and I grew up together, and I call him Charlie, but he is Charles professionally. So I hope you'll all forgive me. Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm not asking for your forgiveness. Okay. Any other questions that we have for today?
Karina's got a question.
Oh, great.
So I'm going to go ahead and unmute you.
Okay.
Hi, good morning. Thanks for having this. So if I got my loan May.
Okay.
So that means that I'm under the first PPP, not PPPFA, right?
Yes.
So does the time frame change? So I think you said it was 6 months to apply for the loan forgiveness and 2 years to pay it back.
Right.
Is that what I'm under, unless I ask for the mutual agreement so that I could then get the 10 months and 5-year payback?
Right.
Yes, you understand it correctly.
Okay. So I hope I can do that.
Absolutely.
And then how we just contact the bank and ask for the forgivable loan application, or?
There's not specific direction on how to do this. All the bill talks about, and I haven't had any clients personally who have done this yet because this is so new, right? And so I don't have any actionable feedback to give you of what has worked in the past. I can only tell you that the bill says that the applicant and the lender must mutually agree. So that's all the information I'm relying on. So that's all I can tell you, which is what you ask. So yes, to confirm what you're asking, yes, you're correct.
Okay, so what I was asking also is, I have to now make an application to have the loan forgiven, right?
There is a process, yes, for the loan to actually be forgiven once the covered period is over.
And every lender will have their own rules for how things are done. You can find the PPP loan application paperwork on the SBA's website, which will get you started, but every lender is going to have their own idiosyncrasies of what they require to meet everything. And so
Wells
we can
Fargo,
give you from the high level view, or we don't work for Wells Fargo, Bank of America, like that, and can't tell you exactly what they do.
Wells Fargo's already contacted me saying that they're able to answer questions about the forgivable loans and a lot of other things. So it sounds like they're going to be helpful, even though they're not getting paid much.
Good to
Yeah,
hear.
and
Overall,
I will tell
overall-
you that you should reach out to your tax advisor to look for that assistance when you start getting specific questions, because we are certainly happy to help you. Okay.
I happen to know that tax advisor very well.
Oh, really? Do you? Huh? Imagine that. Okay. Thanks, Karina.
Okay.
Okay.
So Kristen has a follow-up question.
Oh, great.
Very similar in nature. She's wondering if the 5-page application already filled out, if she should just send that to Wood Forest Bank for her forgiveness.
Okay. So great question. Wood Forest will have their own requirements, right? It's kind of like when you're trying to buy a house, right? I bought a house through Chase once. I bought a house through Mercantile Bank. My second house I bought through Mercantile Bank. They had very different requirements, okay? While the SBA may have the loan paperwork that you have to fill out, Wood Forest also is going to require things like a copy of your driver's license and a copy of your tax documents and that kind of stuff. So you're going to have to put some information together in regards to the application itself. Having the application filled out is good, helpful, absolutely.
Like a good prep document. I've already got this stuff ready. When they ask me those questions, I already have the answers, like a cheat sheet.
Yep, but there's going to be more. They're going to require more. Now, to be honest, the payroll protection program loan applications are not extensive, depending on what type of business you have. If you're an independent contractor, like Charles was saying earlier, it's relatively straightforward. There are a couple of trips that you need to look for. It's going to ask you some questions like, have you defaulted on an SBA loan or a government loan in the last 7 years, for example. It asks you if you've committed felonies and all this other stuff. Like you have to make certain certifications and that kind of stuff. And so you want to read that legalese very carefully. And if you have questions about that, you can reach out to us and we're happy to advise you on that. And I had a handful of people who I helped with the actual application process itself. We cannot act as agents on your behalf directly with the lender or the federal government in regards to these loans, but we can prepare all the paperwork, get everything ready, confirm with you, make sure everything's right, and explain it all clearly, and then provide you with kind of the final paperwork, if you will, which is what I did with certainly a handful of clients. So I hope that answers your question. If it doesn't, make sure and ask another one. What else do we have, Clark? Anything else?
Okay, Tim, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you for your next question.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay, great. Listen, I'm the one that asked about the EIDL and PPP.
Okay.
And so I appreciate your answer on the question. What I want to clarify was, so when I initially applied for the EIDL grant and had not applied for PPP. When I did apply for PPP, I had not received EIDL. So essentially, I received EIDL and PPP funds, both. And so my original understanding was that the PPP would have been reduced by the amount that the EIDL funds, the grant that I received. Anyway, now that I have both, will the forgiveness on the PPP side be, I received $8,000 from EIDL. Will that forgiveness be reduced by $8,000 on the PPP side?
Yes, that's exactly right. You understand that perfectly. So how much of your PPP loan can be forgiven is directly reduced by the amount of the EIDL loan grant, the kind of the forgivable grant that you receive, because you can't double dip between the two. And so however much the PPP loan was, again, let's just use the $20,000 as an example. up to 12,000 in your case would be forgivable. Now, the 8,000 that does have to be paid back, remember, under the new PPPFA rules, if you can mutually agree with your lender, have, instead of a 2-year window to pay back, have a 5-year window. And that 5-year window does not begin until 10 months after the covered period. The covered period ends on December 31st of 2020. So you wouldn't have to start paying back any of the loan, and again, at a 1% interest rate. You wouldn't have to start paying it back until October, basically Halloween of 2021, in which case you have 5 years to do it. So you've got quite the window to get it paid back at a really low interest rate. So if you like leverage as a business owner, which I love leverage for business owners, because what you're saying is, I can turn this amount of money into this amount of money, right? And so that leverage is at a great rate. So even in that scenario in which some of it's not forgivable, you should still view it as a huge positive.
And bear in mind, they're still writing on that fine print, so there is always that possibility that the 24-week period allows you the payroll to cover both of those things, and you don't have to worry about that. But that's not an ironclad. That is a complete conjecture. Just fingers crossed.
Mm-hmm. Does that answer your question, Tim?
It did, and I appreciate your time very much. This is a great,
Thanks
great
for coming.
Okay, the next question comes from Anne Marie. If one branch of the bank isn't doing PPP, should I try another branch?
I don't know the answer to that question. I would guess no, but the branch that you're currently asking who said no, you may just ask them. Are any of your other branches processing these loans? My guess, and again, we don't have super secret, backroom information, but my guess is they won't be. If one branch isn't, my guess is the rest aren't. There were some really specific rules once the 31 pages of SBA regulations came out a couple of weeks after it had first kind of started. Because what was happening is these really large banks, Chase, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, they pushed through thousands. I mean, Chase was the big culprit here. I say culprit. They didn't do anything wrong. It's just the way that it was set up. They pushed through thousands and thousands of applications and they were a large contributor, sure. The large group that secured almost all of the first round of funding. If you'll recall, they had a first round of $349 billion of funding that they pushed through, and they ended up having to come up with, I think it was 250 billion of a second round of funding. And so Chase just took out a bunch of them. And I have a point here, I promise, because then what happens is through that second round of funding, that $250 billion, they set restrictions on how many applications a bank could put through each day. And so that put some of these larger banks who have a lot more resources on even footing with some of these smaller lenders. And so at that point, a lot of these other lenders jumped in, and some of that money is still available. So I hope that answers your question. If it doesn't, please let us know. Okay, what else we got,
Okay.
Clark?
Give me 1 second. Let me mute him again. Okay, the next question will be from Marcia. Let me unmute you. Okay.
Hey, Marcia, thanks for joining us. What's your question for us today?
Thank you all for having the information, providing the information. I want to piggyback on Tim's question regarding the EIDL and the PPP. My company also received both. The PPP was less than the EIDL. I'm not sure if that was done correctly or whatever, but if that's, I'm sorry?
That's probably normal to have less of the PPP than the EIDL, because you could have gotten a lot more out of the EIDL if you so chose. It would be a business decision to do that. Like Kevin was mentioning about that leverage, how much more could I get out of this type of deal. But it wouldn't surprise me that your PPP was less than the EIDL that you received.
So would the part of it will be forgiven, in other words, if I go back to the lender, because we received it early also, if we go back to the lender and they agree on the new rules?
Sure. So let's operate under some assumptions for a moment. Okay. So let's assume that the payroll protection loan was $20,000 and that the EIDL loan was $30,000. Okay. And you can insert your own numbers into here, right? But then let's assume that the EIDL loan that you initially got included a grant of, let's call it $5,000. Okay. So let's just operate under these hypothetical numbers for a moment.
So you have a loan of $25,000 with an IDL and $5,000 of free money to make it a total of 30, correct? Is that what you
No, I'm talking about $20,000 of PPP loan and $30,000 of EIDL loan.
Which 5,000 was the grant.
Was the grant, right? So what that means is $50,000 total in government subsidized loans here, right? 20,000 of it is payroll protection, 30,000 of it is EIDL. But you got 5,000 of the EIDL up front. The $30,000 EIDL loan, 5,000 up front is you don't have to pay back, okay? The other $25,000 of the EIDL loan is money that has to be paid back, okay? None of it is forgiven for any reason, just the upfront grant, okay? The grant portion, which in our hypothetical scenario is 5,000. You with me so far, Marcia?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So now what we've got is $20,000 of payroll protection. Well, 100% of the payroll protection loan is generally forgivable, except any portion that you get from the EIDL grant, which is entirely forgivable, no questions asked. Your payroll protection portion that can be forgiven is reduced to the same sum. So in this case, of the $20,000, 5,000 of your PPP loan gets reduced on the forgiven portion. Not how much you receive. You got the full 20,000, but 5,000 of it is not forgivable, which means 15,000 of the PPP is forgiven and 5,000 of the EIDL is forgiven. And it's not a coincidence that the two equal 20,000, which is your PPP loan amount. Does that answer your question, Marcia?
When I have a drink or two, it'll be
I get it. It's complicated. I totally understand. So I was trying to walk through that kind of slowly. Do you need me to repeat it maybe a little differently?
Just possibly the last part with regards to it equaling whatever. You said 15,000 of the PPP is forgivable, right?
So let me explain it this way, right? Whatever amount you get on the PPP is potentially all forgivable. There is one exception to that, and that's if you also receive the EIDL loan. In your business's case, it received both. So now suddenly you have to worry that a portion of your PPP loan isn't forgivable. You with me so far?
The reason for that is when you applied for the EIDL, you stated, we need this funding. One of the reasons we need the funding is for payroll purposes.
Correct.
And so because it was for payroll purposes, you now have received funding for payroll purposes and received funding for payroll purposes. And so the portion of the EIDL loan that you have to pay back no matter what isn't a factor, right? It's its own 25,000 number. The 5,000 of the 30 that you got, that was a grant, that was free, you don't have to pay back, was attributed to payroll and now has to affect the payroll protection plan that you received. And that's why there's a play there. So sorry, I'll let you continue with the math.
Yeah. And so ultimately, it's just that the forgivable portion of your payroll protection program loan is negatively affected by the EIDL grant. So if in this scenario, you got 5,000 right quick from the EIDL loan, because those EIDL grants came fast, right? That was the government trying to get money in businesses' hands right away so that they could just make the next payroll, right? If in the scenario that we're talking about, you have 5,000.
Right, well, we got ours after. We got the PPP first.
Really? Wow, that's surprising. It may be
that.
that,
I know.
Marcia, it may be that your business did not receive well, no, I don't know that that's possible.
Because I don't remember it saying anything about a grant. I was going to ask you too, how do I find out what part of it was a grant?
It could be that none of the EIDL was a grant. I've not seen that scenario. And to my understanding, that probably couldn't happen. It looks like Clark's pointing at himself. So he's looking like he's going to give us some help. Clark is the one who really processed our company's EIDL loan. So he's got some real helpful insight.
There are some situations where the EIDL, you can be approved for the loan, and if they don't have the correct banking information, you just don't get the grant. It's all the loan. They'll send you a notification via email saying we can reprocess this for the grant or include it just as a loan. So there are some various circumstances, but it's very limited.
So then let's use this hypothetical situation and let's throw a little bit of math out there, and let's assume that what Clark is saying happened. Now I can't confirm that, right? Because I haven't worked with you specifically, but excuse me. Let's assume that you did not receive the grant, but you received $30,000 from the EIDL and $20,000 for the payroll protection program. None of the EIDL would be forgiven, not a penny.
Okay.
And potentially, if you meet the requirements, all of the $20,000 of the payroll protection program could be forgiven. I'm not telling you it all is, I'm saying it all could be. Are you with me? Does that make sense?
Yes, that makes sense. Yeah.
Perfect.
Now that's clear.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks for your question, Marcia. Appreciate it.
Thank you for clearing it up.
You're welcome.
Okay, the next question comes from Anne Marie. I still have not yet received my EIDL. Made application the first week it came available. Is this normal?
Well, I can tell you what, Clark, ours took 2 months, 2.5 months before it came through. And ours took a long time. Mullen Associates took a long time. I have not had any clients report back to me your same situation, but to be fair, I handle a lot of individuals and sole proprietors, kind of independent contractors. And so most of them did not file for the EIDL loan. And so I haven't had anybody come back to me and say it's taken this long. Excuse me. I know ours took quite a long time. So whether it's normal or not, I really can't answer that question. Charlie, do you have any additional
We wouldn't have
insight?
enough context on that. The only insight I'll offer is when I was first researching everything about the EIDL when the Paycheck was first passed, looking at the process for the SBA to do the EIDL, their step. One of the early steps was they assign you an agent, someone that you actually work with. And so if you have at least reached that, what seems to be an early step in that process of hey, you have someone who is now assigned to you, that would be your point of contact. And I would ask them, they would have the context to reference what's the average, what's this, what's the hang up.
Yeah.
They give you some
So
insight
Clark,
there.
what do you think about that, Clark? Did we have somebody that was assigned to us? An agent or somebody that was assigned to us to work with the EIDL loan?
Because I can
Not
read,
that
I can't
I
experience.
Specifically, no.
Okay.
It was more just online based. I don't
Gotcha.
have any needs associated with it.
Okay. So
That's good.
Anne-Marie, based on what Charlie's saying, if you do have a contact, then yeah, absolutely talk with that person. I mean, I would say it's probably getting a little lengthy here for you to have not received it yet. So I personally would start to question and worry.
Right.
But I know it did take us a long time to receive it. Again, like 2.5 months. So at this point, it's probably been 3 months for you.
Marcia's also commenting she applied around the same time and just got the EIDL last week.
Oh,
PPP
great.
back in May.
Thank you for the context, Marcia.
Yeah, thank
So Anne-Marie, it sounds like it may not be that unusual, right? It may be just around the corner.
It's a big backlog.
And that's all the questions we have in the chat. Are there any more questions that you guys have?
Yeah, please, again, just type in the chat, I have a question, and we'll get you unmuted and answer your question. Okay, it doesn't look like we have anything else coming through. I want to say thank you so much for joining us today. Yeah, so Charles and I and Clark certainly put a lot of work into this. If you received value from us doing this together today, I hope that you will share this with your friends. Clark, this should be available as a link on our website within what kind of time frame?
Within 24 hours.
Within 24 hours, this should be available on our website. If you would like to receive this link in an email, please just email us at info@molentax.com. That's info@molentax.com. And we're happy to send you the link. If what you're looking for is some individual answers to your specific situation that we weren't able to cover today, or were a little too private for us to discuss in a public forum like this today, please give us a call. Our line here is 281-440-6279, and we're certainly happy to help you in any way that we can. Other than that, please look to Mullen & Associates for your tax preparation needs, and we'll see you next time.